Most gardeners who struggle with clay soil aren't short on compost, mulch, or effort. They're short on the right kind of fermentation. I see this mistake constantly. People throw Bokashi, compost teas, and random microbial brews at dense clay, then wonder why nothing changes. The soil stays sticky when wet, brick hard when dry. Roots stall, and nutrients just sit there locked up. The problem isn't that fermentation doesn't work. It's that most ferments are built for feeding plants, not restructuring soil, and clay soil doesn't forgive that confusion. On Farm Logic, we care about results, not trends. What I'm about to walk through is a ferment most gardeners have never used, some have been warned away from, and a few quietly rely on because it fixes clay soil faster than Bokashi ever will. I've tested this in in-ground beds, raised beds filled with heavy subsoil, and even indirectly in hydro systems where root oxygenation is everything. If you care about soil structure more than slogans, stay with me and subscribe now, because this channel exists to cut through bad gardening advice with real-world testing. Let's get something straight. Bokashi is not useless. It's excellent for accelerating organic matter breakdown, especially kitchen waste, and it can add a flush of nutrients once it finishes processing in soil. But clay soil isn't suffering from a lack of decomposers. It's suffering from collapsed pore space and excessive cation binding. Bokashi is dominated by lactic acid bacteria. Those bacteria are fast, aggressive fermenters that acidify their environment. In clay soil, that acidity tightens particle bonds even more in the short term. You may see growth improvement later, but the structure problem lingers. I learned this the hard way. I ran Bokashi trenches for 2 seasons in a heavy red clay plot. Nutrients improved, biology increased, drainage barely changed. Roots still followed cracks instead of penetrating evenly. When I stopped treating clay like compost and started treating it like a mineral biological system, everything shifted. The ferment that changes clay soil fastest is a high-oxygen, yeast-dominant ferment built around simple sugars and mineral inputs, not lactic acid dominance. Gardeners call it forbidden because it smells wrong, looks wrong, and doesn't fit cleanly into organic marketing language. In reality, it's closer to a controlled aerobic rot than a polite ferment. Think soil remodeling, not soil feeding. This ferment favors wild yeasts, actinomycetes, and oxidative bacteria that produce organic acids and gases that physically pry apart clay plates. That gas production matters. Clay particles don't separate because you fed them nitrogen. They separate because biology forces space between them. So I build this ferment using non-chlorinated water, unrefined sugar or molasses, and a small amount of mineral clay itself as an inoculant. The ratio that consistently works is roughly 1 gallon of water, 2 tablespoons of molasses, and a loose handful of native clay soil from the problem area. You're not trying to sterilize anything here. You're selecting for organisms already adapted to that mineral profile. Within 48 hours at warm temperatures, this brew develops a sharp, slightly alcoholic, sometimes sulfur-adjacent smell. Now that's where most gardeners panic and dump it out. But actually, that smell tells you yeast metabolism is active and oxygen has not been completely excluded. I keep the container loosely covered, never sealed, and, I stir it once or twice a day to keep oxygen cycling. After 3 to 5 days, the surface shows fine bubbles, not foam, that's your window, but past 7 days it shifts toward putrefaction and loses effectiveness. I've tested this side by side with Bokashi liquid on compacted beds. The Bokashi side greened up faster, but the ferment side loosened faster. By week 3, the Bokashi side still puddled after irrigation, while the ferment side absorbed water evenly. This is not a foliar spray. It's not a feed. It's a soil treatment. I dilute the finished ferment about 10-to-1 with water. For a standard 4x8 raised bed filled with clay-heavy mix, I apply roughly 2 gallons evenly across the surface, followed immediately by irrigation to push it into the top 6 inches. I don't till. Tillage collapses the pore space you're trying to build. Within just a few days, you'll notice the soil surface darkens and, well, it stops crusting. After about 2 weeks, a screwdriver will sink deeper with a lot less force. Now, that's not a nutrient response, that's aggregation actually changing. I go ahead and repeat this once per month for 3 months, then I stop. Clay doesn't really need constant disturbance. What it needs is an initial biological shock followed by stability. Raised beds on clay, they often fail because water just hits the clay pan and, well, it stops right there. A lot of gardeners blame the drainage mix, but the real issue is actually the interface layer. This ferment really excels at addressing that. I apply it heavily at the bed edges and base, where perched water tables form. Over time, roots begin crossing that boundary instead of circling. One raised bed that refused to drain for years corrected itself after 2 applications, not because the soil got lighter, but because it got more connected. I didn't fully understand this ferment until I saw its effect indirectly in hydroponic systems. When I used diluted versions to inoculate inert media like cocoa and perlite, root hairs increased and oxygen stress dropped. That told me the biology favored oxygen transfer, not oxygen consumption. Clay soil suffocates roots. Fixing that is everything. This ferment doesn't just add life, it reorganizes how life occupies space. Let's be honest, this ferment can temporarily mobilize heavy metals and salts in bad soils. That's why I never apply it to beds with young seedlings. I apply it before planting or around established plants with woody roots. If your soil already tests high in sodium, you must follow with deep irrigation to flush released ions. This isn't beginner-friendly, it's, well, effective-friendly. After 1 season, clay treated this way cracks less in heat, drains faster after rain, and resists compaction under foot traffic. Earthworms return without being added. Mycorrhizal inoculants actually colonize instead of stalling. At that point, Bokashi becomes useful again, because the soil can finally process it correctly. Most gardening advice stays wrong because it confuses inputs with outcomes. You don't fix clay by adding good stuff. You fix it by changing how particles relate to each other. Biology is the tool, but only if you select the right kind. If this kind of practical, tested knowledge matters to you, subscribe to Farm Logic. Share this video with someone fighting clay year after year and getting nowhere. Better soil isn't magic, it's understanding what actually moves the needle and applying it with intent. Growing better food starts underground, and it starts with doing fewer things, but doing the right ones well.